On to session three, as it were, and just a continuation of what we had talked about last video, um, kind of about how to understand um, tradition from a postmodern perspective and some of the difficulties that might arise depending on how you kind of identify with different scriptures and different groups that sort of affiliate themselves with certain scriptures. Um, so this would be very difficult for me because I all I know is scripture and tradition, and I know it from kind of what my family taught me, but also because I made the personal choice to kind of study it in a public university. Not as much as from a scriptural point of view, but almost as though to suggest kind of like an outsider's perspective to how they may or may not uh, kind of meet a certain aim as a whole. Like, so how do scriptures in different religions meet the needs of that group? So to try to understand what somebody might want to kind of understand of religion without having an understanding of what the tradition is or what the scripture might kind of suggest to the reader is very difficult for me to try to put myself into as a perspective. So I'm going to try and almost assume that my audience has no idea of what tradition is. Um, so so like nothing regarding the Hindu scriptures or the Torah or the Bible or the Quran. And I list them in that order because when I did study the Hindu scriptures or kind of like the tradition, um, the Vedas do kind of talk about, uh, they don't call them prophets, they call them rishis or seers. So it's almost as though people who are inspired with ideas um, write them down and then they become sort of ways of being and they're preserved over time. And from that, we've got these civilizations that are built around them. So, because I already had a kind of foundation of what the Quran was, studying the Hindu scriptures, and at the time it was also paralleled with uh, Asian religion, so a little bit of Buddhism, a little bit of Christianity and Judaism, and then Islam. They kind of just fit together in a certain way that almost made it look like no matter what part in time we go in, if we study all these communities, sort of piece them together, we can kind of find a way that they're all going to kind of fit without necessarily being antagonistic. The only kind of uh, highlight maybe would be that the specific struggle that a community was kind of facing and how one scripture versus another kind of addressed it. So to say that I can kind of take a Protestant lens and suggest that um, it's not necessarily going to uh, diverge too much from the Vedas is what I think is, I guess, is the closest estimation of where like the average person might be today. So to say that 3,000 years before Christ we had the Vedas and they talked about people being inspired and assuming everything of the universe can be described as originating from one source, so they just explain it as one, and this one entity kind of embodies itself in creation. So all of us essentially have that spirit that connects us all as creation. And then as civilizations kind of build themselves, we need the structure, and um, scripture can kind of help us identify kind of like a groundwork for how to interact with others. So I think if I was to go from an Orthodox, so for example, Catholicism, and go to Protestants, it's almost like Protestantism, I think. It would be like suggesting, um, you know, the Bible worked for a certain amount of years, and then the context changed so much that people started to revisit how accurate it is a reflection of reality and how well it's working for the society that it's in. And they tried to kind of make accommodations, as it were. So it's almost to say, we believe that this was inspired and that there was some kind of miracle around its inspiration, which is why we're kind of holding on to it. But maybe these practices aren't quite relative to where we are right now, so they're not relevant very, like maybe even 1200 years after Christ. So this is, I think, where there's that resistance where this is the norm, like Orthodoxy or Catholicism is the norm, and then to try to branch out from that looks heretical to the majority. So then it becomes this very, very, it's almost like Velcro, like you're just pulling and pulling and pulling, and it's like a painful process. And I think that's where we are right now with Islam, is that it's a very Orthodox tradition as well. And although with migration and people interacting with each other on the internet and understanding about different cultures, they're maybe being a little bit more Protestant without realizing that they are. Maybe Protestant isn't the word, but kind of reformed in a way, or kind of like bringing themselves into a contemporary world and calling themselves like a modern Muslim. Like, I'm not very conservative, or I'm not very strict about these practices. So I may consider myself as a modern Muslim, which is to say, I don't practice all the prescriptions to a T, for example. Having that background is still kind of a mindset that's different from somebody who maybe didn't have that upbringing and trying to approach tradition from a postmodern lens. And I'm not really sure what the entry point would be for either. So I'm going to try to kind of give, just like if we had no idea what scripture or tradition was, and we're just in a postmodern world trying to understand meaning, and to see kind of how we might want to do that. Because like intuitively we might want to go right to scripture and to try to just read through it and see, how relevant is this to my current life. And I don't really know how to kind of give any advice around that. Knowing that we do kind of have this restlessness where we kind of want to find meaning, and we want to find kind of an understanding for why sometimes life struggles are what they are, and how to kind of get through them, because for one reason or another we're having a difficult time coping with maybe some kind of blanket reassurances that maybe just aren't satisfying anymore. It's I do kind of equate it to studying literature, and I think it's mostly because I think of inspiration as something that comes from within, and it's open to everybody. So depending on how you almost deal with a certain ethic with yourself may correlate with the inspirations that you have. I don't really know how I have to study this scientifically in any way, but I know that when we were studying Shakespeare in high school, I used to have to read kind of like a summary of whatever play it was before actually delving into the play itself, to kind of understand what the gist of it was, because it's very difficult, as we know, and to try to figure out all the different meanings as you're going through the play, and then step back and say, well, what on earth was this even about? It's a longer process for me at the time anyway. So the only drawback to doing that is that you're almost limiting yourself to letting the text speak to you. So you might have drawn a different scenario or a conclusion if you had, done the extra work and tried to do it all on your own without like reading Cole's notes or any other summary. So that's the closest approximation to reading scripture, is that there are so many translations now from the Quran. I haven't really studied the other scriptures in depth, but reading the Quran right now, there's a lot of translators who will give sort of commentaries regarding certain verses. So they'll say this verse, for example, or this chapter out of 114 chapters relates to, for example, 100 other chapters that are like it. And the majority of the topic is around oneness. So that kind of almost prepares your mind to understand, okay, well, what is this idea of the universe being able to kind of narrow itself down to one and then divide itself again into this like massive diversity. So if you're kind of preparing your mind in that way, reading those commentaries as to figuring out how these verses connected to the context at the time in a desert can be helpful, because that's kind of like what we can understand of literature too. So if we were to understand literature in Shakespeare's time, it could be I'll read other authors that may be published around Shakespeare's time, and from that I can kind of glean what the culture or the society was like. And I can do this by kind of understanding maybe some of the topics that were discussed, and then how the kind of resolutions kind of evolved. So it's kind of helpful, because from a postmodern perspective, to have all these identifications of the way things are and the way we assume they should be, and then going back into tradition, will always almost pick out all the wrong things. Like, oh my gosh, how could they have done this? Like, it's so barbaric, or any kind of scenario. We'll always kind of assume the most negative, without bearing in mind that it's a good thing that society had all those phases of going through getting things wrong and trying to understand what is ethics and how are we supposed to treat each other, so that as we go through the modern world to the postmodern world, we can see that we're able to be more flexible now and try to understand things as relative to each other rather than an absolute way, because it kind of allows us to appreciate each individual for their independent and unique kind of thinking. So yeah, that's just kind of like a caution for me to kind of just make sure I emphasize, because even I think today, to go into the desert and try to live is going to be almost like starting all over again, and it'll probably be very, very difficult. So just understand that it was a context of tribes and getting together and trying to understand some kind of way of building an understanding that can be understood to be kind of common and general with everybody would be almost near impossible. But it happened. So that's kind of why a lot of people assume that and continue to kind of believe in it as like a miraculous kind of event, or like a movement, all the way back to, pre or in antiquity, I guess. So kind of to kind of appendix this, I guess, or kind of complement all this, is I've been kind of on Facebook for almost a month now, and I've joined several groups that talk about creationism and existential questions, and I find it's kind of refreshing how different perspectives are kind of molding into a narrative and a rhetoric that's not always antagonistic to creationism or evolution, or even like people who are still kind of on the fence and just deciding to identify as atheists. So I think it's hopeful, because it allows people to really, hopefully in a non-threatening way, kind of build their own identity around different scriptures. So even if you decide that, I don't really want to understand how to read the scripture yet, I just want to get a feel for how people are kind of responding to, or trying to understand how people respond to scripture, just to kind of get a kind of vibe for what is the environment like anyway in there, like in a tradition, and how do people use the scripture within to kind of resolve whatever misunderstandings they have with each other. And then kind of pull back and say, well, this is my conclusion after all this time, and maybe now I want to entry point with this scripture, because this is what I've been kind of able to identify with. And just start from there. And that's kind of like, it seems like it is a kind of like a very hesitant and very slow approach. And I think that's kind of the best approach, because to assume that you'll get it in, an overnight kind of try is pretty optimistic. It's a lot of grappling with, well, why do I want to believe this? And is it because this person suggested and it just resonates with me, or is it because it makes sense for me right now? But the more I understand things, the more I have to kind of review, well, I can continue to have that belief, but I maybe need to also identify other beliefs to support it, or maybe, like, so it is a process. And that's kind of what I hope to kind of do with these sessions. This is kind of getting kind of long. So yeah, I hope I continue to build this into some kind of coherence, so it can kind of stage itself into kind of like a step by step process.